Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. Happy full moon, everybody. I guess it was just about a week ago. We had one of those rare occasions where we had the Wednesday tea time where I usually show up and we chat about, well, meandering kind of subjects, but we try to keep it on topic. And I couldn't make it. So it was left up to the lay community. And there's an interesting phenomena that happens, especially for people who've been to a monastery, who've been to a retreat center, who've been to a very prescribed practice environment, is that when they encounter a group of lay people just chatting and following the same meandering path of topics, that usually there's a sense that something's wrong. And so what I heard from a couple of people is that they showed up and maybe the first thing they heard was somebody talking about food or talking about sleep or this or that or the other thing. And they immediately thought, surely this is idle chatter. This is animal talk. This is not the talk of practitioners. I don't want to be here. I want to get out. And I think that's very normal. And I think this is part of what happens when we are exposed to what speech can be. We might not understand the underpinnings of right speech. And so that's what I'd like to investigate together with you this evening, is maybe trying to figure out what the qualities of it are, what it's based on, so that one can know with a bit more certainty, other than having just this nagging feeling of this might be a waste of my time, to be able to say, okay, no, this is the conversation, this is the topic, this is how it's being approached. Maybe it's still salvageable. I don't know. And it's something I've known for a long time, because when I showed up at the monastery, it was one of my first thoughts was, why are the monks talking about this? Maybe they're talking about monks coming or going, or what monasteries were like, or building projects, or who's ordained or who's disrobed, all of these normal topics. And I assumed they're not talking about Dhamma. Why are they just chit-chatting? But it's more complicated than that. And I think when I heard lay people who visited the monastery and then went home, and they would get together in these little groups of people who had been to the monastery to share their common experience together by themselves, they reported back to me, it's like, oh, wow, these people are totally different than I thought. In the monastery, there's something happening that causes you to have a slightly better opinion of the people around you. And if you have no other idea of the Eightfold Path or spiritual training or right speech, there is something you can do to give the people the impression that you are wise, intelligent, and calm. And that is to speak less. Now, this might not be accurate. You might actually be foolish, stupid, and a hot mess. But in order to speak less, it usually requires restraint. And restraint is one of the qualities of a wise, intelligent, and calm person. The person who's not wise, intelligent, and calm typically shows no restraint. So having any amount of restraint over a speech usually implies that we are being mindful of what we're saying and where we want the conversation to go. Yeah. So as a simple in a practice environment, we tend to show some restraint just to talking in general, and this gives us a little bit of peace and a little bit of a buffer. Whereas if you're out in the world, there's usually no such restraint, and conversations can go almost anywhere. And there's beyond this, there is a list of topics that comes up in the suttas, which are called tirachanagata. Tirachana means one who is horizontal, which is how they refer to Pali to an animal. We are those who are upright, animals are those who are horizontal. Just a funny aside. But if you're talking in a horizontal way, then you're talking about usually specific topics which deal with the world, which deal with external things, things outside of a practice environment, things about politics, people, celebrities. The list in the suttas that's given is talk about kings and robbers, ministers and armies, danger and war, eating and drinking, clothes and dwellings, garlands and scents, relationships, chariots, villages and markets, towns and districts, women and heroes, street talk, water cooler talk about those departed in days gone by, gossip, talk about the world and the sea and about gain and loss. And the commentaries will go on to say, basically, and all talk about sensual enjoyment, self-mortification, eternity view, and self-annihilation view. And all of these would be lumped into a category we call animal talk. And you could look those up in the suttas if ever you want to list. But they, at a basic level, these topics of conversation, and everybody might be like, oh no, I talk about these things all the time. I talk about organic food, and I talk about who lives where, and I talk about the leader of that particular country. The thing is, if you sit within earshot of a breakfast table where monastics are talking, it's not that the monastics remain rigidly silent. Often there's a sense of rapport building where they're talking about various things. And this is where these topics become useful. It's recognizing that some topics will generally take us in the direction of greed, hatred, and delusion. If you talk about politics, try to remain equanimous. It's not very easy. If you talked about kings and ministers and thieves and robbers, talk about this country doing this bad thing or this group of people trying to scam us. You're creating an us, you're creating a them. It just leads in that direction. So what happens when we have a subject of conversation that's not on this list? Well, it tends to die out on its own. It tends to take an object which is not inflammatory, which is usually dealing with something tangible. Yeah, who lives where? What food is served? Is it suitable for our particular dietary restrictions? What teacher is where? What do they teach? What do they practice? Little things. What does it take to get a visa to a particular country? These are not. Is it not necessarily animal talk? Often these have something which other talk does not have. And this is a word that the Buddha uses throughout the suttas, and it's atta, A-T-T-H-A. Atta means goal or purpose or intent. And when the Buddha talks about atta, he's often talking about the disciples of the Buddha. He's talking about Buddhist practitioners who have this atta. Unlike people in the world who are finding goals to have, who are finding purposes to have on a day-to-day basis, taking things one step at a time. Oh, there's that thing, I want that thing. And then whether they get it or not, then they move on to, okay, there's that thing, I want that thing. When we have this greater sense of atta, the atta becomes Nibbāna. It becomes peace. It becomes freedom, and it becomes the development of the Eightfold Path in order to attain that freedom. Yeah, so we talk about things which broadly could be characterized as being under the Four Noble Truths. We talk about suffering, the cause of suffering, the end of suffering, and the way to the end of suffering. Now, this is the object isn't as important as the intent, and this is where having an intent is kind of crucial to practicing right speech, and is one of the ways where, besides just speaking less, we can start to analyze our speech and ask ourselves a simple question: do I have a purpose in talking? And if we say, oh no, then maybe we're falling into wrong speech, which I'll talk about in a second. But if we say, okay, yes, I'm trying to get this, well, then we can actually analyze what that goal is. Most of the time, we might find that the goal is not Nibbāna, is not perfect freedom from all suffering. Because if it was, would we even be talking, or would we be really focused on meditation subject and trying to do wholesome things? It's hard to say, yeah. Unless we were doing some, we were giving a compliment or trying to help somebody, it might be too far back in our mind to really say, oh, I am doing this for the purpose of liberation. But it can at least give us a sense, is it wholesome or unwholesome? So there are intents which are intrinsically unwholesome. And these, once we've identified, oh, this is my intent, then we should definitely show restraint towards those kinds of ways of talking. And we covered this, we just did the precepts. And the fourth precept, though it says musawada, to refrain from false speech, this precept, when expanded, covers 4 kinds of wrong speech altogether. And this is a list of how harmful and detrimental and bad they are. Lying, which is the worst, malicious speech or insulting speech, gossiping, and then idle chatter, pointless speech. And the reason I say these are kind of graded in that way, though it doesn't grade them necessarily in the suttas, is you can look at the intent behind them and the ramifications of that. And the Buddha does talk about the weight of various kinds of intentions, what kind of negative karma resultant we get from those. So the first one, lying, is one that the Buddha told his son Rahula, you should train yourself thus. I will never tell an intentional lie, even as a joke. And, at the basic level, it's like, okay, yeah, lying can get me in trouble. But at the highest level, this is a profound appreciation of truth and the power of truth and a fear of delusion and ignorance and deception. And when we instill this in the mind as a basic paradigm, I will not cultivate misperception of the world. I will cultivate that which is in accord with the world, that which is real. This is practice, yeah? This can be our entire practice. It's just anytime we notice a deception in something we see, in something we think, in the chatter of the mind, we say, oh, you're lying. No, bad. And we try to restrain that impulse and ask, where did this come from? Yeah. The second kind of wrong speech is malicious speech, insulting speech. And this usually takes something which is a quality of aversion and it pokes at it. We can hear this in our minds. Oh, they're always like this. Or, oh, what is grumbly person? Or, and they always do this. And there's no satisfying. We can hear all sorts of things in our mind as it starts to talk. And sometimes we'll recognize this kind of speech by the characteristics. Now, for monastics, we have a list of 10 characteristics that we're not supposed to talk about unless the intent is for teaching. These are characteristics of a person. And we actually have a category of, in the Vinaya, in the monastic code, of a confessable offense, which is just for talking about these 10 things. It's called a dubasita, or wrong speech. And I couldn't list offhand what they are, but it's things like deformities, nationalities, religious beliefs, gender, profession, social class, basically, the things that we tend to poke fun at people for, either in just a kind of callous way or in an actual mean-spirited way. Oh, you're from that country, you couldn't possibly get this. Or, oh yeah, you grew up the son of a plumber, this is way beyond you. This is, college level stuff. Just let me handle it. It seems silly talking in this context. We're all trying our best. I mean, you're all doing fantastic, by the way. You all seem intelligently wise, intelligent, and calm. You haven't said anything. But in a practice environment, this usually seems really bad. It's usually really jarring when you hear somebody insult somebody. But this is how desensitized, or how sensitized rather we become to this when we start practicing restraint. It just seems like the wrong thing to do. It's one of the first things you can start to show restraint around. And when you begin to hear it again in the world, it's like so shocking. Like, why would you say that about this person? What could be your intent? Well, the intent is hatred. The intent is ill will. The intent is to put somebody down. It's remarkable when you start showing this kind of restraint, the capacity to do that to another person begins to filter out of the mind. Because speech comes before action, the mind has to form a perception or a view of the world, an intent, before it can take an action. If you start restraining this quality of degrading people based on their characteristics, then your ability to discriminate or show prejudice will begin to dissipate very naturally. Because it can be very hard otherwise to figure out where we have prejudice, where we have biases. Thankfully, we don't have to find every instance of them, because wherever we are in the world, if we went somewhere else, we would probably encounter something. Oh, I wouldn't do it that way. Why are they doing it that way? If we've removed this ability to insult from the mind, if we've restrained it, then what will happen is maybe that's okay. Maybe that's the right way of doing it. I don't know. This wonderful curiosity starts to arise, or like, well, why do they do it that way, rather than they're doing it wrong, which is really the default of the aversive mind, right? And the third one is not as necessarily harmful. It's not as jarring, but it sometimes leaves a really bad taste in the mouth. And this is gossip. Gossip tends to focus on the positive qualities about something. We usually, oh, hey, this is it. We're talking about food, or we're talking about politicians, or we're talking about celebrities, or we're talking about places we want to go on vacation. You know, all of these things. When we start to circle around some pleasant, positive, beautiful quality, we're not. What's our intent? Oh, our intent is to cultivate desire for that thing in ourselves and others, to kind of like, oh, this, you know, and this can be somewhat malicious at times too. If we take a negative quality about somebody and we just want to chat with somebody about it. Oh, did you hear what so and so did, or did you hear what so and so said? Often the intent is to build rapport with somebody based on an unwholesome activity, which is to focus on somebody's bad actions or qualities. Yeah. So we look at our intent and we're like, well, my intent is not necessarily to insult them, but is this the way to go about talking about this thing? Often we'll find if we have a grievance, we should be really careful about how we relate to that grievance. There are certain ways to voice this grievance and try to be proactive about it, but it's limited. And even in the monastic code, we have so many minor rules and observances about how to give admonishment, how to tell somebody they did something wrong, or they could do something better, or this is the way it should be done. We can't just do it whenever we want. Well, often we have to ask permission to give that kind of feedback, which is just, it's not the way it's done, right? Well, this is why it feels different in a practice environment. If you're constantly asking yourself, is this going to be beneficial to the person? Are they capable of taking this in the right way? Am I capable of saying it in the right way? Am I capable of saying this from an intention of metta or friendliness? And if we can't say yes to those, then we have to just bite it. We have to just not say it, which can be really, really hard. And sometimes, even though this is one of the lesser damaging ones in terms of immediate karma, it's kind of insidious, yeah, because it is so hard to restrain when we have a bubbly, positive object for the mind. It's like, oh, I can't wait to talk to so-and-so about this thing that guy did, you know, and it feels sometimes pleasant. And so we overlook the fact that it's going to have very bad consequences, and it will cause probably people to think less of us. And so this is, after we've looked at the other two, this is definitely one to kind of investigate. And what do I do when I have a grievance? How do I relate to it? And am I talking with people about things that are, I'm just talking to build a relationship, but we're talking about stuff that's not actually that wholesome. The final one is kind of pointless talk. We call it idle chatter in the precepts. And this is the final one. And it's not that it's inherently destructive. It's not based on any root except just basic delusion. The idea is that it's kind of a waste of time. That's it. And when we look at the topic of conversation, if it's in that list of things that will generally take us into the world, then we can know pretty quickly it's like, oh, well, I'm probably just chit-chatting. But other times we might work really hard to pick intentionally a good topic of conversation. But if we were to check, we're really just talking to talk. We're tired of all of this, sitting around following the breath. And we just want to have a conversation with a real person, get to kind of ground us in what's going on in the world. But again, if the intention is not based on atta or purpose, then it might lead us nowhere. And at the very least, the negative consequence we might get is that other person will say, next time I should avoid that person. We got involved in this long conversation, which really went nowhere. And I don't know why. So because I don't know why, if I just avoid the person, this can't happen again. And yeah, if you just shut up, that wouldn't happen, right? They would think, oh, it's totally safe to be around that person. They never say anything that, leads us in a bad direction. They're so composed, which may or may not be the case. And now there is talk about noble silence in the suttas, and this is generally it's not held up to be a virtue per se. It's not held up to be something that we should determine necessarily. There were times when monks determined we are not going to talk to each other under any circumstances, and the Buddha often outlawed this. He says, no, this is a wrongdoing. This is not the conduct of monastics. This is the conduct of pigs, to not talk. Yeah, human beings talk when there is a purpose. And so again, this idea of atta will often lead us to when we have a strong sense of wanting composure of mind, wanting peace and stability, often this purpose will override the desire to say something. And we might even find ourselves trying to find a way to get something done without speaking. And you see this talked about in the Pali Canon and the Suttas, where monastics, though they haven't necessarily taken a vow to not talk, they've taken a vow to only talk when there's some practical thing that needs doing. And they ask themselves before they speak, could I convey this without speaking? Either through a gesture or by picking something up or putting something in a particular place. And they found that actually a number of chores, they did it if they set out beforehand, this is what we're going to do at this particular time, no more speech was needed. Yeah? They could just kind of calmly relate to each other as adults and just get things done. And this works really well when we're around people who have this sense of purpose, who are focused on their mind, focused on their meditation. Then it will work really well. Because anything that would be taking us out, that would be, at speech, kind of inevitably disturbs the mind slightly. It makes the mind wobble. Especially once practitioners are cultivating the higher jhanas. After the first jhana, this verbal formation ceases. It's not really there. So if you're just coming out of these higher levels of samadhi, it's hard to speak. It takes effort to kind of remember how that works. And there's a bit of dread as you do it. It's like, oh, this is going to lead places, right? Now, as people who don't have super deep samadhi, we maybe can only guess what this is like, and we shouldn't we shouldn't shoot for the moon, so to speak. We shouldn't hold ourselves to a rigid structure and say, I will only speak like the non-returners. I will only speak when there's something absolutely vital that cannot be conveyed through gestures. Because I'd like to encourage you, if you're out in the world, don't try to convey things with gestures. Just say something. Yeah, it's just a lot safer. Uh, as practitioners, we are encouraged to start where we are. And so, again, I think the best place to start is to start at the bottom, to really look at first, the intent, the goal, and then if it's an unwholesome one, determining, what category does it fall in, what kind of object is it taking, and to just work on that. This is the reason the Eightfold Path is given as it is, as the sort of basis for spiritual practice. It's not don't talk or only talk about Dhamma, because that's not really feasible. We don't live in a world where it's possible to not talk about practical things. We, I mean, we can be reborn in such a realm. And if you set an intention to be reborn in such a realm, good for you. But that's not the human realm. That's not the world we live in. Those people who can get by without talking are so few and so special that we should just say, no, sadhu, good for you. Probably not feasible in this lifetime. For the rest of us, we look at how can I speak effectively? And when you're doing it this way, then you often see opportunities for growth, opportunities for understanding other people. So the Buddha, he talked. And if the 45 years of collected teachings of the Buddha, 40 volumes in the Pali Text Society edition of the Buddha's teachings are any indication, the Buddha talked a lot, a lot. Yeah. But he always had a purpose. Yeah. One, he was never ambiguous. When he was saying something, he usually spelled it out. He didn't leave anything up to misinterpretation. So this is why you see a lot of lists and a lot of complete lists when the Buddha could have said, etc., etc., etc. He didn't want to do that. He treated every person like they mattered, like he wanted them to understand the Dhamma properly, as it is, in the right order with the right phrasing. And so he focused on that. When he was speaking, he was trying to convey this. But he wasn't always talking about Dhamma. The thing is, in the Pali Canon, when the Buddha is not talking about Dhamma, it usually glosses it over, saying, and the Buddha engaged in amiable and courtesial, I forget what the word is, cordial, that's it, cordial talk. He kind of built rapport with the person by just talking about safe subjects and kind of a little back and forth. Now it's glossed over because this is very situational, and you have to actually have metta or compassion or sympathetic joy or equanimity to do this effectively. But furthermore, and I couldn't find the reference, and it may only happen in one place, but the Buddha says he has a very specific intent when he engages with people. He has a thought in his mind, and his thought is, I will speak with them abiding in equanimity, with the thought, may I provide what they need so they can be on their way. Now, if we're an aversive type, this seems obvious. Yeah, this is how we relate to all people everywhere. I am trying to get rid of them. Speech is a conduit for getting them to leave the room. People are annoying. But this was not the Buddha. And when it's held in the right way, this intention, may they get what they need, cannot always be fulfilled through speaking. And even though the Buddha was always trying to provide people what they needed so they could be on their way and practice diligently, many of the people stayed around him for his entire rest of his life. Like Ananda, he just wouldn't leave the Buddha's side. And the Buddha kept saying, like, go to a hut, meditate, Ananda, practice, be diligent. You'll regret it if you wait till I die. And sure enough, Ananda kind of had to regret it, because the Buddha passed away and he wasn't fully enlightened yet. And he had to work really hard on his own. Yeah. So sometimes having this intention of may they get what they need, you recognize you really can't provide it. And that's okay. You do what you can. And abiding in equanimity is saying, well, I will try to listen to what they're asking for, what they're trying to get at. I will assess their intent. And if you assess their intent is wholesome, then chatting with them really doesn't do any harm necessarily, because your intent is wholesome and their intent is wholesome. And gradually, if the basis of the conversation is wholesome, has a purpose, is trying to lead to understanding, then gradually the conversation will either lead to Dhamma, or we'll get to a point where the person feels satisfied. They realize, okay, I've gotten what I need. It's getting late. You see that in the suttas a lot. People will be having a wonderful time listening to a Dhamma talk, and then finally say, look at the time, I've got stuff to do. And the world kind of overrides their desire to just keep chatting with the Buddha. And the Buddha's equanimous, so he doesn't go finally. He just goes, yeah, I'll do what you need to do, right? Because he saw it coming. And nobody can just pester him forever. He knows things are impermanent. He's a Buddha. Yeah. But there's also there's ways that we can develop our empathy, and one way that comes to mind, though there's plenty of ways, is the Buddha's relationship to questions. So when he wouldn't start conversations necessarily unless he had a clear point of teaching, yeah, unless he was trying to convey something to somebody and he saw that they might be able to understand. Otherwise, he didn't start a conversation. And when you meet teachers and practitioners like this, it can sometimes be jarring. You'll be sitting there and they'll be sitting there and you'll be like, come on, Dhamma, let's go. This comes up in the Pali Canon too. There's some people who are just like, look, you're a monk, teach Dhamma. And in one case, the monk just said, oh, there'll be a time for that. And they assessed that the person didn't really have any respect. And if they don't have respect, then how are they going to get anything out of the Dhamma talk? So the monk just went on their way, and the person went to their companions, and they're like, what's going on? I fed this guy. I gave him robes, and he didn't teach me the Dhamma. And they're like, were you respectful? Did you bow down? Did you ask for a Dhamma talk? Did you, have you taken the precepts? Have you done anything to kind of warrant, that kind of effort? And the person is like, oh, no, I was kind of rude. And once they cleaned that up, and then the monk gave them a Dhamma talk, and they understood, with the basis of respect. So this is kind of the first thing that we try to cultivate, just as a baseline towards other people, is respect. And this is shown in the Mahayana Sutras specifically. There will be bodhisattvas who bow down to everybody, who relate to everybody as an important teacher. Everybody is trying to teach me the Dhamma. And this really beautiful way to relate to other people. Do not assume, that guy's deluded, they're a schmuck, it's a waste of my time to talk to them. This is only going to lead in bad directions. But to assume there might be something I can learn from this interaction. Let's watch, let's listen, let's pay attention. And sometimes when people, the Buddha had to teach the monks how to relate to people who are asking questions, because it's totally possible, and actually, when you get down to it, likely that people will be asking a question from a not very clear intent. It might be greed, hatred, or delusion. They might have some misunderstanding, and that's why they're asking the question. They sense that there's something off in their way of viewing the world. And so they're asking somebody that they trust might know something about it to inform them. Yeah. And so the Buddha had to teach the monks, and he gave lists of how to relate to questions. And this is a great way that we can develop our own ability to have empathy for a person, is to ask, well, what is the person trying to get, and how can I best provide it? So the Buddha said there's 4 ways of relating to a question that's been asked of you. One is to answer it categorically. And that is to say, to give a factual response. And one way is to answer it analytically, to begin to take apart the question and to take apart the answer that you would get, and to kind of lay it out in steps. It's like, oh, okay, I kind of see what you're getting at. Maybe this is what you're talking about. Okay, yeah, then this leads to this, leads to this. Do you understand? The third way is to answer with a counter question. Maybe the question is just so not clear that you can't really provide a good answer because you can't read minds. Most of us can't. Yeah, so you ask follow-up questions. You're like, are you looking for this? Is this what you mean? Does this sound like what you're describing? And it's a great way to kind of take something that's a not clear intention and to focus it towards a clear intention. Sometimes the person doesn't know what they're looking for, but through the counter question, you can help them find it. And then you both know exactly what's being sought. Maybe you can provide it, maybe you can't, but helping them find that purpose is truly a gift. Is one of the amazing things about human interaction when you can help somebody find purpose. And many of the biggest realizations came from this process of analysis and counter questioning. Yeah, people came to the Buddha assuming something, and they asked a question that revealed their misunderstanding. And the Buddha kind of revealed it to them, and then they're like, "Oh wow, I was asking based on this understanding that was wrong, and your counter question has revealed it." But not just the Buddha, all of the Buddha's disciples were capable of doing this. It just takes a simple, I say simple, straightforward, you listen. Don't think about what you want to say. Don't think about, yeah, what is this person intent and is this a waste of time? Just listen to what's being asked. Yeah? And the final way that you might respond to a question is just to set it aside. And the Buddha would often do this when the question had no good answer. And you've probably heard me do this a lot. People will be asking, oh, so are things permanent or impermanent or eternal or not eternal? Or what do you think about this teacher? What do you think about that teacher? What do you think about nimittas? What do you think about the fourth jhanas? What do you think about? And I'll just set it aside. I'm like, there's no good way to answer this. Yeah. That in and of itself is a fantastic kind of restraint because you're pushing the person away necessarily. You're just saying, like, look, I don't think I can provide a useful answer to this question. So let's just set it aside. Is there anything else you need? Often they'll be able to think of something. That's the way conversations work. So these are all some basic ideas up to, the more practice-focused ones that we might use to employ on our speech. So the next time you are in a Dhamma chat room, and everybody starts talking about food or sleep or music or something, who knows? Maybe you will be the one who salvages the whole conversation. Maybe you will be the one who wades in there knowing these fundamentals of right speech, and you help get things on course, because I'm not going to be there every time. And at some point I will be dead. And then it'll be totally up to you. As it is every time we turn off the session and you go on your way, it's totally up to you to find yourself in good conversations that kind of lead your practice forward, or you find yourself in conversations that you later regret and use as a basis for learning and growth. Yeah, that's totally up to you, which is where you land. So I offer these thoughts tonight on the full moon for your investigation. May they be of benefit.